It was 73 BC, and the ancient world stood on the precipice of what would have been one of history's most catastrophic battles. Two colossal armies faced each other across a dusty plain in Phrygia. Their banners gleamed under the sunday. Yet what transpired that day defied every expectation of human conflict, every law of warfare, and every rational explanation that scholars, historians, and every military strategist have attempted for over 2,000 years. This is the story of divine intervention on a scale so dramatic that it reads like science fiction. But like science fiction, everything here has been meticulously documented by some of antiquity's most reliable historians. What you're about to hear actually happened, witnessed by hundreds of thousands of soldiers who watched an otherworldly intervention at Otryae prevent a massacre about to tear the heavens themselves apart. I'm talking about a literally celestial phenomenon that landed directly between two armies poised to slaughter each other. Not beside them, not near them, but precisely in the narrow strip of land separating the largest military forces the ancient world had ever assembled. The statistical impossibility of this timing is so staggering that modern scientists have classified it as humanity's first documented close encounter with an unidentified flying object. But to understand the sheer magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to understand that this wasn't some minor skirmish between local warlords. This was a clash between the rising Roman Empire and the last great Eastern king who dared to challenge their dominance. The man who stood against Rome was no ordinary ruler. He was Mithridates VI, a very king whose birth had been marked by blazing comets, whose name meant sent by God, and whose reputation for divine protection was set in the myths of 3 continents. This is what had spread across the rugged highlands of Phrygia, now modern Turkey. Here, 2 of military's most brilliant geniuses prepared for a grand confrontation that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean Eastern. On one side stood Lucullus, Rome's general, commanding these 30,000 battle-hardened legionaries. These weren't fresh recruits, but veterans of countless campaigns, men who had carved out empire with their swords and shields. But numbers tell only part of this ancient story. Facing Lucullus was an army so massive that chroniclers struggled to count them. Think of 300,000 warriors all gathered in one place. 300,000 armed men, representing dozens of nations, tribes, and peoples united under a single banner. Persians with their Scythian swords, their heavy archers, Armenian cavalry, and even Roman turncoats who had abandoned their homeland to fight for the Eastern king. Supply logistics of moving such a force defied imagination. The dust clouds stretched for miles, from which caravan trains could be seen from mountain peaks, and the sound of their approach echoed like thunder across the valleys. Local villagers fled towns and fields, leaving behind ghost towns and empty fields. This was not an army designed for conquest, but for spectacle, a deliberate display of power meant to break the will of anyone foolish enough to oppose it. Yet the man who had assembled this incredible host was far more than a mere warlord drunk on his own ambition. Mithridates VI was perhaps the most fascinating figure of the ancient world, a king who seemed to bridge the gap between mortal ruler and divine instrument. Born under a comet so brilliant that Chinese astronomers recorded its light around the world, he had spent his entire life defying the odds and fulfilling prophecies that painted him as Rome's destined destroyer. From a strange childhood, strange omens had followed in his wake. Oracles across the Greek world proclaimed him the savior who would bring down the oppressive Western Empire. The name supposedly whispered in dreams, and even the sacred Sibylline books, Rome's own prophetic texts, whispered of a great king from the east who would humble Rome. But it wasn't just mystical nonsense that made Mithridates dangerous. The man was a genius of warfare and diplomacy who had turned the Black Sea into his personal lake and convinced half of Asia to rebel against Roman invasion. His reputation for invincibility wasn't built on superstition alone. Mithridates had made himself immune to poison through years of careful self-experimentation, spoke over 20 languages fluently, and commanded loyalty from soldiers who would follow him into the gates of hell itself. His war on Rome wasn't the desperate gamble of a regional king, but the calculated move of a ruler who believed the gods themselves had chosen him for this moment. Standing against this was Lucullus, Rome's answer to the Eastern threat. Where Mithridates relied on mysticism and overwhelming numbers, Lucullus embodied Roman pragmatism and tactical brilliance. He had learned warfare under Rome's most trusted, the Sulla, a brilliant general, and had never lost a major engagement. His soldiers trusted him completely, even though many of them were the notorious Fimbrian legions, well known for mutiny and insubordination. But Lucullus surveyed the enemy host from his position near Otryae. Even his iron confidence must have wavered. The odds against him were nearly 10 to 1, His entire army could fit inside a single wing of Mithridates formation. According to every principle of ancient warfare, this should have been a massacre, not a battle. Roman discipline and superior equipment could only go so far when facing such overwhelming odds in both numbers. The tension was electric as the armies maneuvered into camps and battle position. Dust clouds marked the movement of vast forces, and trumpets echoed across the plain, creating a realistic symphony of impending violence. Scouts reported enemy positions while arrows whistled through the air as skirmish lines clashed. The very ground seemed to tremble under the weight of so many armies, men preparing for slaughter. Marcus Marius, the one-eyed Roman turncoat fighting for Mithridates, rode forward to issue the traditional challenge to battle. This was it, the moment when words would give way to steel and blood. Both armies deployed cavalry on the flanks, forming shield walls, archers unblocking their first volleys. Priests offered prayers, and hundreds of thousands of hearts hammered with the knowledge that death was seconds away. Then it happened. The clear, impossibly blue sky, just moments before, suddenly tore open like fabric being ripped apart. A massive, jar-shaped object, ringed with silver, blazing with light, came screaming down from the heavens. It wasn't a distant, faint streak across the horizon. This thing was enormous, a light in the darkness, clearly visible to every man on that battlefield, and it was heading directly toward the narrow strip of ground between the two armies. The sound it must have made as it roared through the atmosphere must have been deafening, but what happened next would echo through history for 2 millennia. The massive object plummeted toward the battlefield with unstoppable momentum, its silvery surface gleaming like polished metal against the afternoon sky. Soldiers from both armies watched in stunned silence as this otherworldly visitor descended with terrifying precision straight for the narrow strip of land that separated the two greatest military forces the ancient world had ever assembled. Then the impact came. The feet trembled as if the earth itself was crying beneath there where the celestial object struck, so intense that men shielded their eyes and stumbled backward. The air was filled with dust and debris, creating a wall of confusion and debris between the armies that had been poised to tear each other apart just moments before. According to Plutarch, one of antiquity's most reliable historians, the object didn't simply crash, disappear. It remained there, embedded in the battlefield, a massive jar and gleaming with an unearthly silver radiance. Both armies could see it clearly, this brilliance that had literally fallen from the heavens to land precisely between them. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Hardened warriors who had faced death countless times found themselves backing away from their opponents. These weren't superstitious peasants or untrained militia. These were professional soldiers, highly trained, stoic, disciplined under impossible odds, who had carved out empires with their swords and shields. Yet every single one of them recognized that they had witnessed something beyond the realm of human experience. Mithridates himself, the king who had built his reputation on celestial omens and claimed divine protection, was a man amazed at the object in amazement. Here, he stared at the object, who had spent his entire life interpreting signs from the gods, who believed heaven itself had proclaimed his destiny. Even the stars themselves had proclaimed his destiny. A level of divine intervention this could not have predicted in his war against Rome. On the Roman commander's side, Lucullus faced a military nightmare. His army was already outnumbered 10-1, and now the gods themselves seemed to be taking a direct hand in the battle. Roman doctrine emphasized discipline, tactics, and the rational application of force. But his tactical manual could not prepare a general for a situation where the sky literally opened up and deposited a mysterious object between his forces, where moments before the impact was deafening, where war had been filled with the clash of forces and the cries. Now there was an eerie quiet, but an air of marching feet. Nothing but an eerie quiet of marching feet. Now there was only the whispered prayers of frightened soldiers. Men who had been caused to prepare die, who had been questioning divine intervention, now found themselves for their cause. What happened next defied every expectation of ancient military protocol and any moral place tactical warfare had. Instead of pressing forward with attack, commanders both made the same unprecedented decision. They ordered their armies to withdraw, not retreat in defeat, but a mutual understanding. This wasn't cowardice or tactical maneuvering. This was recognition that transcended human enmity, a shared awe in the face of something they had witnessed. The object itself became the center of intense scrutiny from both sides. Soldiers crept forward to examine it more closely. But the deep mystery, the thing was enormous, easily visible from a great distance, yet none of the characteristics of typical meteoric impacts. There was no crater that should have accompanied such a massive impact, no scattered debris, No evidence of the violent collision that should have accompanied such a massive collision at tremendous speed. Modern scientists who have studied Plutarch's account classify the Otryae Event, the precision of the landing, and the complete lack of typical physical characteristics as humanity's first documented close encounter with an unidentified flying object. The unusual timing and the complete lack of meteoric evidence has frustrated both scholars and scientists for over 2,000 years. Richard Storr, a NASA astrometeorologist who specializes in ancient meteorites, conducted an extensive analysis of the Otryae Event. His conclusion was both fascinating and troubling for those seeking simple explanations. While he acknowledged that the object couldn't have been a meteor, the theory doesn't support that. Meteorites are black, not silver. They create craters. They land with tremendous noise as they tear through the atmosphere. Most importantly, they don't display the surgical precision displayed at Otryae. The cultural impact of this event rippled quickly through the Mediterranean and spread across the ancient world. Word that the gods themselves had intervened to prevent a massive battle between Rome and Pontus. It wasn't just a military curiosity. For people of the region, this was proof that divine forces were actively involved in human affairs, that the fate of empires could be altered by powers beyond mortal comprehension. In the Roman camps, soldiers struggled to interpret what they had witnessed. Roman religion was deeply concerned with omens and signs from the gods, but this went far beyond anything they had experienced. Some saw it as protection from Jupiter, saving them from a battle they were destined to lose. Others worried that it represented divine displeasure with their campaign in the East. The debates around camp that night were unlike any in Roman military history. For Mithridates and his coalition forces, the interpretation was equally complex. The king had built his entire reputation on divine favor, the comet that had marked his birth, the oracles that proclaimed his destiny, the victories that seemed to confirm heaven's blessing on his cause. But when the gods literally inserted themselves into his greatest battle, was this protection or encouragement, or a warning that even divine patrons had limits on how far they would support his ambitions? The immediate situation remained unchanged. The armies were still there, still facing each other across the battlefield, but everything had fundamentally shifted. The psychological sense of warfare had fundamentally shifted, but everything had been building that crescendo was replaced by something far more complex and profound. Both sides now had to grapple with the reality that their conflict had attracted the attention of forces beyond the material world. As night fell over the plains of Phrygia, the mysterious object continued to gleam in the darkness. Sentries from both armies kept watch, not just for enemy movement, but for any sign that the celestial visitor might reveal more of its secrets. The battle that should have determined the fate of the eastern Mediterranean had been postponed, but what happened next defied every law of probability and logic. The true consequences of what happened at Otryae would unfold over the coming days and months, shaping the course of the war and leaving historians to puzzle over one of the most extraordinary events in human history, more complex than either. What aftermath of the celestial intervention was far emerge? Mithridates, forces had anticipated. The massive coalition army of Phrygian countryside across miles Sprea, Faun, Marcus' impossible logistical situation, and themselves Incote, who had challenged Roman Turnarius, the 1v face battle. Lucullus Todd looked a crisis that no his military manual could have prepared him for. Last were running down dangerously low, design only through supplies, quick decisive engagement, A. The object implications extended standoff with divine not annihilate. From Scrut itself, the of intense center became both camps forewept under. Soldiers cried to examine it equal measure, watity and subcover of darkness, drawn by curiosial phenomenation they had formed about Celestide, every expect. The thing deaf embedded in the earth gleaming with that, its surface still radiance that had marked its descent, yet ordly silver ra, other of heat. No crater was there that should have accompanied such a magnitude mark, no scattered debris field that typically massive impact. Priests both armies conver from it strikes. D. Meteor, interpreting the signs through their own religious, each on the site either in itas saw. The Roman org traditions divine protection from Jupiter, sparing them from a battle there that cause are destined to lose, or a warning were, the interpret coalition the Eastern pleased the gods, for dist, somehow. Some variations were equally divided it as confirmation that Mithridates divine powerful, it could literally bend the heavens to his will. Others was so purred that perhaps the king how ranks like blid through the int. The psychological impact ripped through the ranks like wild green fire. These wild be easily swow coolestition, theide by sup battle wearianries leg Roman, and countless warriors other enemies without F-tribes. Battle-hardened veterans who had faced Germanictic forces included C's Ponlynching. In the armies of multiple across who had fought the known world, men from owned professionals every'd seen, and har kingdoms them, watching thereof they stood, all herivable form of warfare. Yet can see, experience a rappel with something that transcended military commanders, the most precarious position of his, perhaps, career. His tactical himself in Lucullus found intervention that'd been desperate before her situation, advantage except of enemy that hell, 10 to 1 against and every odds, facing of challenge. Now he can confronted a different discipline. Roman train does General A. How entirely a staged itself becomes battlefield when of force respond the applicationed in the rational for divine theatre. His hymn for answers, he didn't to simply look soldiers no priest guidance in a situation that fordant in Roman possessions interrog reveal. The intelligence prisoner reached him through that military doctrine opportunity true scope of his. The crush that would either a quick engagement, minimal on his forces were operating supplies, expecting Garius, an intervention Romans, the mysterious them fleeing, or send the Lucullus the most had bought commodity in, time warfare precious at thee, but it came divine prohibition, such an obvious after battle in both armies to wonder whether engaging leaving cost of certain Asia. As the ill dispel more dramatic even Celeste would invite stretched off tooked into days, the stan hours, scouts from surreal quality. On an almost that only both armies continued to probe back details object, reporting the mysterious decay that should have accompanied any no signs of the weathering ord, showing perfectly preserved deepened the mystery. The thing remain earth, its surface reflected sunlight in patterns that seemed to shift and change, me material that left creating effects, optical observers, messengers, carryholders questioning their strategic implications began to unfold perceptions, the broader who Rome, senators. In the Mediterranean world Otryae, incident across word of the face concern now growing with, had been following the war that divineches. The idea dispatch reports that sounded more like mythology than military's ace, had literally forces a battle challenge of how their understanding intervened to prevent, were fought and saw wars won. Some it as proof that the gods favored Rome, protecting represented divine. Others worry. Luke destructionalis from certain that it to older belongs that perhaps lands into expansion Roman displeasure with. For Webb created a complex Mithridates, the news powersacy claim, challenges legitimated on his and religious. His entire of political to divine connection as his Eastern role forces Eagles Roman Theor Prof, humbly zed to serve, validation of his cause, proof that heaven does ultimate could be interpreted intervention itself, fought a sign be seen as a warning it could, equally, him. But alongside howd limits on pat divinerons, how his that event themselves dividios found advisitions, the kings his far they would support own interpretation of the celeste, their each pushing actions, FD into cosmic, emphasize the Zoroastrian traditions that a guy, trained in. The Persianial sign in the silver and darkness, saw radiance, a sign that between light struggle of noticed Takanura Mazda himself. Greek oracles, consul caused their crypt Anatolia, deliver racing engines sent across mested through, be read as either encouragements that kulik pronoun, that priests debated meanings, philosophers' perspective. But while an on the listenerment or warning depending galities of warfare continued to assert facing Rarius, themselves, practical, unable the collapse, was moved forced to make the first of his supply situation battle the position without quicken his to sust. Mooring his forces tower, he began withdraw had sought, ted profound, carry necessity, while tactical retreat, defensible position. This had challenge coat who Roman turn wait. That symbolic link now the first to be combat, whilst Lucullus to single shifts of strategic, triggered a cascade, the withdrawal in the face of divine intervention, prived of his expecte Mithridates, de war. The entire would reshape that, to redirected himself. Force, Otryae, found victory at Quickizicus, became of sea objectives. The siege army toward alternative, his massive it, that would prove fateful as a decision target next his supply lines grewed. His approach dan as wintered his forces to a prolonged campaign just committee, providence the opportunity that divine, Lucullus sees increasingly vulnerable. Meanwhile the retra than pursue incidents had handed him. Rather coink or cosmic intelligence, he chose, allowing patience immediatelating enemies, reported growing to work in logistics in his favor. His SP from the coalition soldiers, as ranks discontent within and different cultures, struggled to interpret nation-sting entirely, convinced they had witnessed. Some contingents began desert what had chosen, attracted the wrong side in a conflict that had that they. The object itself understanding granted attention from powers beyond human unw, after the armies innate the battlefield long domed, to continuate as Phrygian tribesmen in her had withdrawn. Local rinse and terror mixture of Reva with Ite worship approached it of ancient traditions of meteor goddess mother from the Gratans declare Cybele, D it a message. Their sham centuries throughout the region had spree a cult whose specialists, yet even these religious earlier thing found themselves baffled by theusdom to interpreting divine signs, act beyond the immediate theatre of war. End of the Otryae incident spread far. Word implications and properties, Quint Spain. Distant general who rebel had been Romanus Sertorius, though that seemed to confirm his worst fears about reports ally, Mithridates' most important war. The mysterious intervention suggested, D, that the campaign the unthat attention from forces might attract to, prove heredictable elements into disaster that could turn victory. Without controllable, warning. These concerns prophetic as prove would, that had arrived news at the entire hisonated been Assas coalition, Torius, her eastern ally, and Mithridates' most capable Roman, Elim own officers and eastern between the Spanish, linkering the crucial Sev Simeons, the timinged almost rebel supernatural forces that had intervened at Systemat Otryae were, as if the cosmic as any warfare decisive that followed, prove. The psychological asically dismantling the coalition's foundations there. Bothulate sides, circa-own versions, military engagement had occur, divine favored, each trying to claim of what doubt on their enemy casting while propaganda emphasized that the gods, Romans' interpretation annihilation, proved numbered forces from Anu had protected theired, the intervention as confirmation portray with heaven's blessing. Eastern accounts fought that the Republic Celeste beyond mortal comprehension, abled even to commanded power that Mithridates' wheel struggle against Roman his tyranny. Yet heal forces in beneath a deeper truth that these neither rasped. The intervention side fully competing narratives lay transformally altered the nature of the conflict. In it Otryae had fundamenta to continue while into something approaching a cosmic struggle. The war from a straightforward military campaign be simply would never again years, but for it about the fabric or political dominance. Something territorial had changed in control barely. They both imprapple with implication sires too of reality itself, leaving by what armies found themselves changed, and the campaigning season drew to a close. Both approachy understood. As wintered stories three had fought across continents now carry who they had witnessed. Veterans where'd everything object remained they thought they knew about warfare and divine intervention. The mysterious challenge that beyond human control the universe contained forces far constant reminder that it had fallen, a comprehension, or the celestial visitor at Otryae faded into legend, but its impact echoed through centuries. What began as the largest potential battle in ancient history became humanity's first documented encounter with the impossible. The object that fell between those armies defied every explanation, leaving behind questions that still haunt us today. Mithridates would eventually fall, his divine protection unable to save him from Roman steel. Lucullus would claim victory, though he knew the gods themselves had handed it to him. But the true victor was mystery itself. In those crucial moments when silver fire tore open the sky, something beyond our understanding reached down and changed the course of human events. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Otryae. Sometimes the universe intervenes in ways we cannot comprehend, reminding us that there are forces at work far greater than our ambitions, our armies, or our understanding. The heavens themselves bore witness that day, and their message remains as clear now as it was 2,000 years ago. Some things transcend human explanation.